100-Word Horrors, Number 1. I'm Steve Stockton. In the old house, the walls whispered secrets. At night, Claire heard her name being called in a voice that sounded like dry leaves. One dark, rainy evening, she slowly pressed her ear to the plaster. "Come to us," it hissed. She felt compelled to follow the request. Descending into the dark basement, she found a hidden door. Inside the hidden space, portraits of long-lost family members stared at her from the walls. As she stepped closer, the door slammed shut. The whispers grew louder, then stopped. She realized too late she was just another portrait waiting to be painted. Every night, James saw a shadow moving on the stairs. It always appeared at the stroke of midnight, creeping closer to his room. He tried to ignore it, but each time it seemed more defined. One night, curiosity got the better of him. He waited at the bottom of the stairs, flashlight in hand. As the clock struck 12, the shadow appeared, solidifying into a figure. It turned, revealing hollow eyes and a mouth stretched in a silent scream. James ran, but the shadow followed, merging with his own. Now, he waits at midnight, forever part of the darkness. Lila inherited an antique dollhouse from her grandmother, an exact replica of their family home. Each morning, she found new dolls inside, eerily resembling her deceased family members. One day, she noticed a new doll resembling herself lying in bed. That night, she was gripped by a fever and couldn't move. She watched helplessly as unseen hands rearranged the furniture around her. The last thing she saw was her doll double closing her eyes. When her family found her missing the next morning, they never suspected Lila had been replaced. She was now a lifeless doll in the miniature bed. Sophie bought an antique mirror from an elderly woman at a garage sale. It was beautiful, with an ornate gilded frame. But as soon as she hung it in her bedroom, strange things began to happen. She began to see movement in her reflection that didn't quite match her own. One night, she startled awake at midnight, shocked to find her reflection standing beside her bed, grinning. Suddenly, she found herself sucked into the mirror, leaving her reflection on the other side. Now she watches helplessly as her reflection lives her life, knowing no one will ever know the truth. While exploring their new house, Tim and Sarah discovered a hidden door behind a bookshelf. Inside was what appeared to be a child's room, untouched for decades. Toys were strewn all about, and an old leather-bound diary lay on the bed. Reading it, they learned about a boy who had disappeared. That night, they heard whispers and the sound of a ball bouncing. The next morning, Tim was gone, never to be seen again. Sarah found his name written in the diary, the ink still wet. She realized with horror that the room demanded a new occupant every generation. Dan missed his usual train home from his second shift job. He was forced to wait and caught the midnight one instead. As he boarded, he noticed the other passengers were unusually silent, their faces pale. The train moved faster and faster, the landscape outside blurring into darkness. Dan tried to ask where they were headed, but no one responded. The train screeched to a halt in a desolate, fog-covered station. The conductor, a spectral figure, approached Dan and whispered, "Welcome to the last stop." Dan felt his body grow cold, realizing he would never leave this train. Emma loved hiking in the forest, but she had always avoided the dense thicket at its heart. One day, however, her curiosity got the best of her and led her inside. She found a clearing with ancient trees forming a circle. As dusk fell, the shadows elongated and the air grew cold. Suddenly, she heard whispers and saw ghostly figures emerging from the gnarled trees. They beckoned her to join them. Terrified, she ran, but the forest seemed endless. When she finally stumbled out, she realized she had aged decades in a single night. The forest had claimed her youth. Megan moved into a charming old farmhouse with her 2-year-old son, Alex. Soon, Alex began talking about a new friend, a little girl named Lily. Megan assumed it was just an imaginary friend, until she found old photographs of a small girl matching the description Alex gave. Further research revealed that Lily had died of influenza in the house 50 years ago. One night, Megan heard giggling and found Alex playing with a ghostly figure. Lily turned to Megan, her eyes hollow and dark. "Stay and play forever," she whispered. Megan grabbed Alex and fled, leaving the house forever haunted. One summer day, Emily found a beautiful antique locket at a flea market in the countryside. Inside was a photo of a young woman from the 1800s. That night, she had vivid nightmares about the woman being murdered. Each time she wore the locket, the nightmares grew worse, and she felt an unseen presence watching her. One dark night, she woke to find the woman from the photo standing at the foot of her bed, her eyes filled with agony and sorrow. "Find him," she whispered. Emily knew she had to uncover the woman's story before the nightmares consumed her. Jake and some of his school friends dared each other to spend the night in an abandoned hospital. It was a decaying, eerie place, rumored to be haunted. As they explored, they found old medical equipment and patient records. Suddenly, they heard footsteps and saw a figure in a hospital gown. They followed it to the operating room, where the figure disappeared. The wind howled, and ghostly patients appeared, their faces twisted in pain. Jake felt a cold hand on his shoulder and heard a whisper, "Join us." They fled, but the hospital left a permanent mark on their souls. Mrs. Thompson was a quiet woman who lived alone in the house next to Amy and her parents. One day, she vanished without a trace. Curious, Amy decided to investigate. In an old garden shed, she found Miss Thompson's diary, filled with entries about strange shadows and whispers in her house. One night, Amy saw a shadowy figure in Miss Thompson's window. She went inside and followed the whispers to the basement, where she found a hidden room. Inside were old photographs of previous owners, all missing. The shadows enveloped her, and Amy became the next entry in the diary. Mark bought an old oil painting at an estate sale in farm country. It depicted a pastoral, serene landscape, but at night the scene changed. Dark figures appeared, moving closer to the foreground. One night, he woke to find the figures depicted standing at the edge of the frame, staring at him. The next morning, he noticed his own house had appeared in the painting. Terrified, he tried to destroy it, but the painting seemed to be indestructible. That night, the figure stepped out of the painting and into his room. Mark's screams were the last sounds he ever made. Lisa received a strange phone call from her friend Jess, who had died in a car accident some years before. Jess' voice was distorted, filled with static, but unmistakable. "Help me," she whispered. Lisa tried to trace the call, but found nothing. Night after night, the calls continued, growing more desperate. Lisa's phone showed no number. One night, she heard Jess's voice coming from inside the house. She followed it to the attic, where she found an old phone still connected. Picking it up, she heard Jess's final scream. The line went dead, and so did Lisa's hope of peace. Every night, precisely at midnight, a bell tolled in a remote English village, but no one could identify its source. Local legend claimed that it marked the hour when the dead walked among the living. One night, curious, young Paul decided to find the bell. He followed the sound to an old cemetery, where he found an ancient, weathered bell tower. As he reached the top, the bell's tolling stopped, and he saw ghostly figures rising from the graves. Before he could flee, the spirits surrounded him, their eyes hollow and cold. The bell tolled once more, sealing his fate. In Emily's new apartment, an old West Side brownstone, one room was always cold and silent. She avoided it until one night she heard faint music behind the door. Curious, she opened the door and found an old gramophone playing a haunting melody from an old record. The room was now furnished in 1920s style. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut and the music grew louder. Shadowy figures danced around her, and she felt hands pulling her into the dance. The next morning, her friends found her apartment empty, except for the gramophone playing a skipping old record. Every night, there was a door in my apartment that led nowhere. By morning, it was always gone. One night, I decided to stay awake and watch for it. At midnight, the door appeared. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped through. I found myself in a dark, endless hallway. I turned to go back, but the door had vanished. Panic set in as I heard footsteps behind me. I ran, but the hallway seemed infinite. Now I'm stuck here, wherever here is, typing this on my phone, hoping someone will find me. The footsteps are getting closer. I moved into a new apartment and noticed my neighbor, Mr. Johnson, always watching me from his window. One night, I heard a scratching at my door. When I opened it, no one was there, but I found a note, "You're next." Terrified, I called the police, but they found nothing. The next night, the scratching returned, louder and more frantic. I peeked through the peephole and saw Mr. Johnson's twisted face. The door burst open and he lunged at me. I woke up in a hospital, told I'd been found unconscious in my apartment. Mr. Johnson had vanished. Every morning, I saw a shadow being behind me in the bathroom mirror. It was always there, even though I was completely alone. One night, I decided to confront the shadow being. I stood in front of the mirror, staring into my own eyes until they felt like someone else's, and everything else seemed to fade away. Suddenly, the shadow being moved on its own, stepping out of the mirror. It smiled with my face and whispered, "Your turn." I felt a cold pull and found myself trapped inside the mirror, watching helplessly as I was now the shadow being. While traveling across the country for work, I checked into a quaint old hotel. The receptionist warned me that room 304 was apparently haunted, but it was the only available room. That night, I heard whispers and footsteps around the room. The temperature dropped, and an eerie presence filled the air. I saw a shadowy figure standing by the window, staring at me. Paralyzed with fear, I couldn't move. The figure whispered, "Leave now." I fled the room and checked out immediately. Later, I learned that room 304 was haunted by a guest who had been murdered there years ago. While camping alone, I heard whispers deep in the forest every night. They seemed to come from all directions, growing louder and more insistent. One night, I followed the whispers to a clearing where I found a circle of stones. In the center, a small box was partially buried. I hurriedly dug it up and opened it, finding old photographs of people who had gone missing in the area. Suddenly, the whispers turned into screams. I ran back to my tent, but the forest seemed to close in. I barely escaped, but the whispers still haunt me to this day. Once, I received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end sounded like mine, but older and more desperate. "You have to leave now," my older voice said. "Your life depends on it." I laughed it off as a prank, but the calls kept coming, each one more frantic. Finally, I decided to listen. I packed my things and left my apartment. A few days later, the entire building exploded. Nothing was left. The police said it was a gas leak. I'm still shaken, wondering if I really had been warned by my future self. About a year and a half ago, I started seeing someone who looked exactly like me around town, many of the same places I frequented. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then my friends and family started confusing us. One day, I confronted my doppelganger. It smiled and said, "Your life is mine now." Before I could react, it pushed me down a flight of stairs. When I woke up in the hospital, everyone called me by a different name. No one believed my story. Now I'm living some random stranger's life, while my doppelganger lives mine. I found an old photograph of my childhood home at a flea market on the outskirts of my old hometown. In the background, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the window of my old room. That night, I had nightmares about the figure. When I visited my parents next, I showed them the photo. My mother went pale and said, "We never told you, but there was always something in that house." I stayed the night there with them and woke up to find the very same shadowy figure at the foot of my bed. It whispered, "Welcome back." Driving through the New England countryside, I got lost and ended up in a small, silent town. No one was around, and the streets were empty. I knocked on shop doors, but all were closed. As night fell, I found an old hotel and decided to stay. At midnight, I heard whispers and footsteps outside my room. I peeked through the window and saw ghostly figures walking the streets. They looked like otherwise normal townsfolk, but their eyes were hollow. I left at dawn, desperate to escape. When I looked back in my rearview mirror, the town had vanished. A strange mold started growing in my apartment. No matter how much I scrubbed and cleaned, it kept coming back, spreading across the walls and furniture. One night, I woke to find the mold was now covering my bed, seemingly creeping toward me. I packed a bag, fled the apartment, and stayed with a friend overnight. When I returned the next day, the mold had taken over completely. I found a note on the floor: "Leave now or become one with us." I never went back. The building was condemned, but I still see mold in my nightmares. Working late at a department store, I noticed a mannequin that seemed to move around the store on its own. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, but one night the mannequin was gone. As I was closing up, I saw it standing in the middle of the store, staring at me. I decided to leave, but the doors were locked. The mannequin's head turned slowly, and it started walking toward me. I hid in the storage room until morning. When I came out, the mannequin was back in its proper place, but its eyes seemed to follow me. I found an old photo album with pictures of a childhood friend I didn't remember. As I flipped through the pages, memories of our time together started flooding back. But the more I remembered, the more I realized something was very wrong. The friend had died in a car accident back when we were just small kids. That night, my sleep was restless and I had vivid dreams of our adventures, but with a dark twist. I woke up to find a note on my nightstand. "Remember me." The photo album was gone, and I was left questioning my sanity. Soon after moving into my new house, I began to hear strange noises coming from the attic. I went up to investigate and found an old dusty mirror. As I cleaned it, I saw the reflection of a ghostly figure appear behind me. Startled, I turned around, but there was no one there. The figure started appearing more frequently, always in the mirror. One night, it reached out and touched my shoulder. I felt a cold, paralyzing fear. The next day, I smashed the mirror and buried the pieces. The noises stopped, but I still feel the ghost's presence. Camping by a remote lake in a national park, I heard stories of a monster that lived in its depths. I laughed it off until one night I saw something large and dark moving in the water. The next morning, I found strange webbed footprints around my campsite. That night, I heard splashing and saw the creature emerge from the lake. It had glowing eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. I barely escaped, but the creature followed me to the edge of the forest. I never went back to that lake, but I still hear its haunting calls in my dreams. I found a cheap apartment with a quiet roommate. She never spoke and always kept to herself, which suited me just fine. One night, I heard her crying softly in her room. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The crying continued for weeks. Finally, I asked the landlord about her. He looked quite puzzled and said, "You don't have a roommate." I checked her room and found it empty, except for a diary detailing her sad life and tragic death. The crying stopped, but I still feel her ghostly presence, silently watching me from the shadows.